The impacts predicted over 4 years ago are unfolding across Trinidad, Tobago, and the wider world as a result of climate change. As the world warms, we're seeing increased temperatures, increased extreme rainfall events, including stronger hurricanes, and rising sea levels. Now, how is that impacting us here in Trinidad and Tobago? And what exactly are world leaders doing about it? At COP27, we saw leaders from around the world gather to negotiate terms that will limit warming across the globe to 1.5 degrees Celsius below pre-industrial levels. We also saw multiple agreements come forth to finance this change, moving to a greener planet with renewable energy, as well as mitigation and adaptation measures for small island developing states. We also saw an increase in awareness towards loss and damage funding and an agreement to establish one next year. But how is Trinidad and Tobago going to be affected by all of these changes happening globally and locally? In the Caribbean region, projections from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change showed the region generally getting drier, meaning less overall rainfall, but experiencing periods of extremely heavy rains, which lead to major street, flash, and riverine flooding. According to the Trinidad and Tobago Meteorological Service, over the last 2 decades, we've seen these projections materialize. And if you don't believe them, just take a look outside. As we enter the last month of the year, we've experienced one of the rainiest wet seasons on record, with October being Tobago's wettest October, while in Trinidad, November broke the monthly rainfall record dating back to the mid-1900s. Most of the rains during both of these months fell during 3-day periods, where accumulations inside 72 hours rivaled the average rainfall accumulations for both islands during an entire month. The result? Widespread flooding and landslides that have continued into December. But floods and rising temperatures aren't the only concerns for Trinidad and Tobago. Based on the latest projections from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and the World Meteorological Organization, with data processed by the Ministry of Planning and Development, by 2030, many of our coastal communities may be underwater. When looking slightly further to 2050, many areas across the southwestern, eastern, and along western Trinidad will be flooded. If a Category 2 hurricane were to hit Trinidad and Tobago with sea levels at over 1/3 of a meter above its current levels, the flooding alone could be unprecedented. Even worse, if a powerful Category 5 hurricane were to hit, similar to Hurricane Irma in 2017, wiping Bermuda off the map, Trinidad could likely see a similar fate. Thankfully, this scenario is less likely based on historical records. The country has never seen a Category 5 landfall in the last century. However, these same reports show by 2100, Trinidad and Tobago's average air temperature could increase by 3.6 degrees Celsius, or annual rainfall decrease by 22 to 30%, while sea surface temperatures and sea levels rise to unprecedented levels. These projections have far-reaching implications, from where people live, the destruction of our coral reefs, coastal communities and beaches being lost entirely, our water security, our food security, the potential mass internal migration, complete loss of infrastructure. This list can go on and on. Unfortunately, as these projections come to pass, we're seeing devastating impacts unfold. In the last 5 years, Trinidad and Tobago has experienced unprecedented levels of flooding, with 80% of Trinidad underwater in October 2018 and a rivaling flood event just last month. With sea levels continuing to rise as extreme rainfall hits already elevated rivers, there is nowhere for the water to go but up, covering roads, bridges, and many low-lying communities. But even more concerning, when it floods, floodwaters are taking much longer to subside, taking a mental toll on those affected who are left to pick up the pieces, or a physical toll for those having to face the threat of waterborne or mosquito-borne diseases. After the break, we'll take a closer look at where to date has seen some of the worst flooding and hear from the victims. Later in the show, what's being done on a global stage to tackle climate change. Flooding in Trinidad and Tobago is a multifaceted issue, and it's difficult to attribute flooding to one sole cause. We know that climate change is causing our showers and thunderstorms to produce heavier rainfall rates in localized areas. Now, this results in severe flooding, and with poor development and drainage, it leads to catastrophe, as we saw in early November.
My whole place flood out. Just last month gone, I got flood out. This month again, I come and I get flooded. I can't take it no more. What is the cause of this flooding? Is this thing with this man, the housing area? Because I on this road since I was 8 years, and we never get flood regular. We never used to go through this.
With heavier rains, we also see waters rise at a pace not seen before in Trinidad and Tobago.
After all that rain, thunder and lightning last night, the water came up so swiftly. Just couldn't do anything. I just had time to put up the fridge and the stove on.
Geography also remains a significant contributor. As we develop on hillsides, increase the area of impermeable surfaces, and continue building in floodplains, some communities are doomed before the rains even touch the ground. The Caroni River Basin is a perfect example. The Caroni River is the country's largest watercourse, running for nearly 40 kilometers south of the Northern Range, covering approximately 600 square kilometers. But the bamboo settlement is the worst-case confluences of watercourses where the St. Joseph, Tunapuna, Guayabal all join the Caroni River. What this means is when the Caroni River is already filled from torrential rainfall in the east and central Trinidad, any additional water moves directly into Bamboo, Valsayn South, and St. Augustine. Between October and November this year, for the first time in 70 years according to longtime residents, the Caroni River overtopped 5 times in less than 5 weeks. The consequences were dire. This is the height of the floodwaters at this particular spot in Bamboo number 2, just around 4 feet. But in some parts of this community, we saw floodwaters rise above 10 feet of water, and the community was only accessible by fairly large boats. What that meant? Complete and utter devastation for some, and we are still seeing, a week after floodwaters subside, mounds of garbage being picked up across the street. This is the face of climate change in Trinidad and Tobago, where communities are regularly affected by devastating floods, and some families continuing to lose everything. For many on the heels of their last flood cleanup, the waters came once again, but always worse than before. It pushed many to the breaking point.
Where he was supposed to go to?
Okay, yeah, he also they come for a little holiday. And look at them, everything. I don't know how he's going to be after go. I don't think that I change the clothes in the road. This is too much. Too much.
When the water started to come up yesterday?
Yes, yesterday evening it started to come up, but this morning it started to flow through the whole place. He couldn't save nothing. He go and he buy a pump to pump the water, and the pump couldn't help it. Stop nothing. Look all the line and thing run. I ain't bragging.
With already elevated sea levels, at high tide, floodwaters can even rise when rainfall ceases, another impact of a warming planet. This phenomenon is best observed in South Trinidad. Residents of Woodland know that floodwaters are determined by the tide, even though we're 5 kilometers away from the coastline. It's been 2 weeks since this particular area where I'm standing was covered with over 5 feet of water, and even then, the flooding is still near the roadway. Those that traverse Pluck Road as an alternative route to Mosquito Creek knows it's a very flood-prone area, with many still using the roadway even when inundated. This is where climate adaptation measures begin to be instituted, as small or large as a flood gauge. The damage is done. Sea levels are rising, more extreme rainfall trigger more flooding events across low-lying communities like Woodland along Pluck Road where I'm standing, and the Ministry of Works and Transport trying to adapt roadways to the changing weather conditions. They've installed a flood gauge along Pluck Road to allow drivers to see the height of the floodwaters as they drive through it. A dangerous practice, but it's one that's going to become more common as we see rising sea levels combined with increased rainfall. Within the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, there are multiple climate financing mechanisms, and one geared to adaptation set the South Oropouche River Basin in its sights. The South Oropouche River is home to about 200,000 people. It channels water all the way from Maruga through Penal, Debe, and Barrackpore, making its way to Woodland, where I stand right now 5 kilometers away from the coast. Now, this particular river has been known to overtop many times in the past, but in the age of extreme weather and climate change, the water levels just aren't subsiding as quickly as they used to. In fact, based on climate scenarios, this particular river basin could see losses anywhere between 19 and 36 million US dollars annually. That's why the Adaptation Fund has committed $10 million US for adaptation measures within the South Oropouche River Basin, including wetland rehabilitation, improving the capacity of farmers and fishermen to adapt to the flooding, as well as community engagement to educate the inhabitants of this river basin to the impacts of climate change. The project was approved in April this year and is expected to be completed by 2026. But until then, the flooding continues. This means that other, more immediate climate and flood mitigation measures need to be implemented. As sea levels rise, rivers will have a much harder time with runoff. That's why governments around the world and right here in Trinidad and Tobago will be installing flood pumps in various communities like this one behind me to deal with the excessive rainfall that devastate our communities. In the South Oropouche River Basin, the operation of such pumps and floodgates have remained a contentious issue. Residents have claimed and showed the media that personnel required to manually open and close the floodgates are nowhere to be found. In the past few months, the flood pump at the Tulsa Trace picnic site have repeatedly failed, and this is another area where multiple tributaries meet a major river, the South Oropouche River. Now, you've seen the impacts of climate change across Trinidad and Tobago, but what happens when areas like these become unlivable? I'll have the details just after the break. With multiple areas being flooded time and time again within weeks, residents have repeatedly said they are fed up. But what happens when people are so frustrated, communities become abandoned, or even worse, the government is forced to condemn the area like they did in 2018 at Granville as a result of a coastal erosion-induced landslide? Today, around 1% of the world lives in an uninhabitable zone where conditions cannot support life. By 2070, that percentage can increase to 19%, and it includes parts of Trinidad and Tobago where the seas reclaim land and flooding renders low-lying communities uninhabitable. I spoke with Kiran Khan, a graduate of the UWI Institute of International Affairs, who said this issue is already ongoing, just not locally yet.
According to my studies in 2015, we understand that there's a link between climate change and migration. That's pretty easily accepted. But at the time of being at the UWI Institute of International Relations, it was very hard to establish a link between climate change leading to migration and migration leading to national security. So since 2015, we've seen waves of migrants on the shores of Europe. We've seen waves of migrants out of Mexico, Latin America, making that Central American journey to North America. So that link is very easily established. We've seen it in China in the 70s, where there's desertification, there's flooding that leads to millions of people being displaced. So we understand that climate change leads to migration, hence the term eco-migration. What is a little bit harder to prove is the link between climate change being a national security issue.
The Ministry of Planning and Development has looked at this link in consultation with the Ministry of National Security. Specifically for Trinidad and Tobago, the Planning Ministry has said it is a security threat as a result of limited land, limited financial, technological and human resources, food insufficiency and volatile food prices, as well as water management problems, to name a few highlighted issues. Can also went on to explain the link, but using an example on conflict we won't necessarily associate with climate change.
In international relations, climate change is considered a soft issue. National security is considered a hard issue. So in 2015, we were still dealing with the war on terror. That's a national security issue from a geopolitical perspective, right? In countries like ours, we might have been dealing with food security, much larger issues at the time. So trying to prove that link was a lot harder, right? So you're looking at cases like Syria, where there was drought for 50 years. You're looking at an increase in the population between 1950 to 2012, in which the population soared. Water scarcity became an issue because, coupled with the demand for water, there was less rainfall over a 50-year period. What started to happen at that point, it's a very well documented case, is that the land started to dry up. There was no water for agriculture. So people began to leave rural areas and migrate into the city areas. So that led to conflicts between the rural dwellers and the city dwellers. In some cases, it might be distant cousins moving in, but in some cases, it's persons subletting. But you have people of a different tribe or a different sector, a different class system moving in. Then they're all competing for very scarce resources. So essentially what happened in cities that we now know by name is that the conflict started to sort of foment. When the Arab Spring came along, it just lit the fuse on what was Syria. So we know the names. We know Aleppo, we know Damascus. We understand these cities are centers of conflict. What we don't see is that they weren't started as a result of the Arab Spring. These conflicts were 50 years in the making leading up to this point, essentially.
But with floods and coastal damage already reaching levels that are displacing chunks of the population for days and even weeks, where do we go from here?
I would say this, there is a lot of research that shows what happens. Climate change doesn't happen in an instant. So we're seeing flooding, we're seeing high rainfall in shortened periods of time. We're seeing dry seasons, wet seasons. And we're seeing storm events that are unprecedented. So we understand all of that. Climate change is a much slower burn. So what is happening, as you rightfully said, is areas are becoming inundated. At some points, some parts of Trinidad may become inundated, and then the water may at that point never recede. Those are possibilities. What happens in cases like that has less to do with climate change and more to do with the socio-economic conditions of the country. So in a country that is more homogeneous, or a state like we just spoke about Syria, but we can compare that to California, where there were drought conditions for a number of years. But because the population is more economically stable and there is a more homogeneous population, there is more stability. Now we have to ask if Trinidad is a homogeneous population. We are becoming a little bit more homogeneous, but in times of especially scarcity of resources like food and water, water being number one, what happens is that lines that were drawn in sand begin to be redrawn, and you have cases of haves versus have-nots. You have racial divides that happen. So what happens when areas become uninhabitable is that we're going to try to transplant people to new areas, and that can lead to problems in itself. The biggest problem there is a socio-economic one, and less a case of weather events from a climate change perspective.
The Ministry of Planning and Development says the best way to avoid charting the course into a world with Trinbagonian climate refugees would be to avoid climate change. But the world has already committed to a certain level of climate change impacts, given that at COP27, fossil fuels were not even part of the major decisions to phase down or phase out. However, according to the head of the Multilateral Environmental Agreements Unit at the Ministry of Planning, Kishan Kumar Singh said, adaptation may be our best option. In a presentation on climate change and security, Trinidad and Tobago has to charge towards full integration into socio-economic aspects and national development with a focus on resilience building. According to Kumar Singh, socio-economically resilient societies are more likely to absorb shocks and impacts than those with weak governance structures. Climate change is a trillion-dollar problem, and governments around the world are trying to get the private sector involved in spending millions and billions of dollars to help small island developing states and developing nations. We'll hear from some of them just after the break. There are billions of dollars available for climate financing for adaptation and mitigation through climate funds from the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, like the Green Climate Fund, the Global Environment Facility, and the Adaptation Fund. Trinidad and Tobago has received millions of US dollars in funding for several environmental projects over the last 10 years. At COP27, a new funding mechanism was agreed to be established: loss and damage.
Reparations for climate death now, right?
It was a major win for activists and small island states who have been calling for such a fund for the last 3 decades. The idea of the fund was to have wealthier, long-polluting nations pay into an account which can be used by developing nations on the front lines of the climate crisis who disproportionately feel the impacts of climate change, though their greenhouse gas emissions remain low. The name of the fund refers to the irreversible economic and non-economic costs of extreme weather events and slow-onset climate disasters such as sea level rise and melting glaciers. The loss refers to things that are irreversibly lost, while damage refers to things that can't be repaired or recovered. Economic costs include lives, jobs, property, food systems, and territory irreversibly lost. In contrast, the harder to quantify non-economic costs refer to the loss of culture, identity, sovereignty, human dignity, biodiversity, and psychological well-being. The decision, though, was mostly symbolic. Over the next year, a transitional committee established at COP27 will make recommendations at COP28 on the operationalization of funding arrangements and creating the fund. The committee would also have to develop recommendations that define where funds originate, conditions on who will receive the money, and ensure coordination with existing funding arrangements. However, according to Raquel Moses, the only UNFCCC Global Ambassador representing small island developing states, there was a notable win.
Some of the wins we got from COP was definitely a decision on loss and damage. It's something that we had been talking about for over a decade. And to finally have a decision on loss and damage, first, to have it be the first time that it's even on the agenda for discussion, and to get a decision at the point where it's up for discussion, huge win. And as much as we can say that we're not making enough progress, that's an absolute milestone moment. So at COP26, we had 2 million. It was first 1 million pounds, and then it turned into 2 million pounds. And then we had some philanthropists come on board, and some other a municipality in one country come on board between last year and this year to the tune of 20 million. This is understanding that a single incident for the US, Hurricane Ian, was $67 billion worth of damage. Notwithstanding, in COP27, we've had $230 million further commitment. So it's, 10 times the amount that we got in the last year, committed in one 2-week session.
In the interim, the private sector and multinational banks are being engaged to provide potentially life-saving funding for countries looking to adapt to this warming planet. At COP27, these companies were abundant, making deals with small island states. One company, NOAA Region, signed a memorandum of understanding with Antigua and Barbuda to develop the financial infrastructure needed for the country to fund its green transition sustainably. In an exclusive interview with Guardian Media, NOAA Region Chief Executive Officer and founder Frederick Degret said he is targeting the blue carbon economy.
The idea is to start auditing the potential of carbon sequestration, biodiversity credits and more from their natural resources. So we're talking about the green for sure, with already existing methodology that we try to improve, but also with the blue. So one of our developed technology through our R&D company, which is Blue Carbon Lab, it's a French company. It's using combined satellite imageries plus a very powerful algorithm plus machine learning modules that now delivers with quite a high precision the quantity of carbon sequestrated into the waters. So from it, we can unlock heavy numbers of carbon credits. Then what Antigua and Barbuda has been trying to push is to become a pioneer country into the Caribbean, which we believe for the which we believe it's a good spot for starting to make an impact with a potential global effect, because Caribbean is a very hot spot for this. So the idea is to, they have been accepting to re-inject 70% of what we're going to unlock into a circular economy for the transition, and using that resources as the risking part for private equity, private debt, and public funding. So this is, they have accepted to use that cash, new resources, to de-risk. So private, let's say, public funding, first loss, due diligence, technical assistance, everything that the current financial model is not able to fund, or with such a slow mechanism that keep the private equity capital untouched, unlocked, and the private equity capital is a game changer. So this is a very important tool, the way we operate the blended finance here, because blue carbon is multi-trillion-dollar market. If it's used properly to de-risk, we can talk about more than $100 trillion to be back into the circular economies for the transition of those island states, mostly island states.
While NOAA Region wants to create a model for the Caribbean, another company launched millions in financing for clean energy projects across the region. In an exclusive interview with RMI Project Director for the Global South, Benjamin Bottle, he explained the two funds available for the Caribbean.
So the Caribbean Climate Smart Fund is a fund that's been established by RMI and Lions Head Partners. They're an asset manager with a lot of experience in energy funds in Africa. We're currently setting up the fund and have our first contribution to what's known as the Project Preparation Facility. The Project Preparation Facility is going to be supported now by Open Society Foundation, who provided some grant finance to establish that, and we're in later stage conversations with another 3 funders around the investment facility, which will provide the capital necessary to make the investments on the ground. Now, what the Caribbean Climate Smart Fund will do is in particular target off-grid, but also utility scale investments. Those investments will save on average, if we're looking, I'll give you an example here. If it's capitalized with $75 million, within 18 months, we think that $75 million can be dispersed as projects are prepared by the Project Preparation Facility, working with RMI and project developers in the ground in countries. These project developers are from the Caribbean. We think we can disperse $75 million. We're looking at an average CO2 emission saving of around 420,000 metric tons. And the big news is it will save the countries, for $74 million invested in 18 months, around $24 million in fuel savings from imported fuel. And not only will this create resilience in terms of energy supply, it also means that these islands are no longer reliant on importing these fuels and have their own local sources of renewable electricity. It's also going to bolster the clean energy workforce in those countries. Working with the Energy Transition Academy that we also have at RMI and Carolec, organizations like Carolec, we'll be working with the engineers and those people that will be involved in creating those renewable systems on the ground. And it's a fantastic opportunity to really show other nations around the world what distributed renewable energy, solar and wind can actually achieve.
He added that they've identified a number of projects across 20 Caribbean islands, including many in the Lesser Antilles like Trinidad and Tobago.
We actually have identified a significant pipeline of around $600 million of projects that need that technical assistance that's going to be provided through the Project Preparation Facility, as I said, funded by the Open Society Foundation, and to get those projects off the ground. We find there's a convergence of capital out there that's ready to invest. Project developers have a project pipeline ready to go. We just need to bring the funding together with the project pipeline, and we can create those investments and have that. Yeah, exactly. Make it happen on the ground. Have the investments really flourish.
The company is also operating micro solar grids in the Caribbean.
That's what we're doing in Puerto Rico at the moment. Is we are working with the infrastructure and companies and organizations that are essential during times of blackouts or storms to help them have reliable source of electricity. Some of the grids that we've installed, I believe it was in the Bahamas. There was a hurricane that hit, a Category 5 hurricane, and these grids withstanded that. And the same with some of the infrastructure that we had installed in Puerto Rico. We had colleagues there on the ground actually there to experience this. And it's of critical importance that these facilities, such as healthcare, gas stations as well, because people need to get around in these situations after a storm for effective recovery. It's essential that these facilities have electricity and energy so they can keep functioning. And that's the importance of distributed energy. It doesn't rely on the infrastructure for the transmission infrastructure that might actually be impacted by a storm. And these standalone units are actually quite resilient. Not only are they resilient to storms, they also are a resilient form of energy access. It doesn't rely on expensive imported fossil fuels from elsewhere. And it's not at the beck and will of the global supply of fossil fuels and those costs.
There is also another player in the Caribbean region that has been key in matching investors to climate-friendly projects. And you heard her earlier, the CEO of the Caribbean Climate Smart Accelerator, led by Raquel Moses.
So we work really closely with CARICOM, and CARICOM has come up with the CRIF insurance mechanism, which provides early liquidity to countries right after the disaster. And we think that supporting CRIF and helping them further develop and deliver new solutions is really where we need to be putting our effort and energy. And so I think more things like that. We also have some other solutions, like the Caribbean Development Bank has come up with the recovery duration adjuster, and we don't feel like enough people are talking about that. That is a solution that allows us to measure our vulnerability and access concessionary finance as a result of our vulnerability. And so that is another solution coming out of the Caribbean that was announced at COP26 that is being further developed during COP27. And we want to get it at the point of where the UN and other major agencies like World Bank, etc., are taking this on as the way that we measure access to concessionary finance.
Moses added that those global climate financing facilities we spoke about earlier, well, they got a boost.
So there are a number of new commitments to the Adaptation Fund as well, several hundred million. So, and that's great, because the Adaptation Fund, which helps us adapt to the changes that are taking place, is completely grant funding. There are no loans or equity or any other kinds of instruments. And so more support for the Adaptation Fund is huge and excellent. But we need to build our capacity to even apply to things like the Adaptation Fund and the Green Climate Fund. And we definitely didn't see enough in terms of commitments towards mitigation. We are still headed towards a 2.9 degree world, which is uninhabitable. That is massive loss of biodiversity, and that is extreme coastal erosion, that is mass migration. But there are so many solutions coming forward, entrepreneurs coming up with new solutions, and a potential optimistic future where we have circular economies and a better habitable environment working in harmony with nature. And that's what we need to be focused on. How do we deliver on that possible future versus avoiding something that's catastrophic?
Climate change continues to ravage countries globally, but what is the government doing in Trinidad and Tobago to mitigate its impacts and make the country more resilient and adaptive to its changes? The details just after the break.
I am pleased to present a statement on behalf of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago.
Planning and Development Minister Penelope Beckles led a 12-person delegation to Sharm el-Sheikh, Egypt at COP27, which was designated as an implementation COP from the start. There was some progress at the International Climate Conference, according to Beckles.
Trinidad and Tobago embraced the progress made at COP27, particularly on the agreement to establish the Loss and Damage Fund, the Just Transition Program, and the increased focus on food security and agriculture, nature-based solutions, recognition of a healthy environment as a right, and the other multilateral initiatives such as the deforestation pledges.
However, with the promise to establish a fund rather than one being opened at COP27, the minister said there is still much more to be accomplished.
This is not the end, however, as much work remains to be done in terms of operationalizing the fund and implementation thereof to ensure that the fund is not just an empty shell, but fit for purpose, sufficiently resourced, and in line with human rights, climate justice, and the needs of communities and indigenous peoples. While we welcome the much-needed establishment of a finance facility, we recognize that no amount of money can recompense communities who have suffered the irreparable losses of their territories, their cultures, and of course, their traditions.
But the final decisions presented as the Sharm el-Sheikh implementation plan left much to be desired.
While we count the wins, we must also acknowledge the areas that did not satisfy our expectations. The outcomes on mitigation in the cover decision were particularly disappointing. Achieving the temperature goal of the Paris Agreement is of existential importance to SIDS and Trinidad and Tobago, and redoubling efforts and commitments to ambitiously pursue mitigation by all countries are, of course, critical. Building on COP26 outcome should have been a major goal of COP27, but instead we note that with some alarm, there has been increasing emissions in developed countries.
COP27 was a whirlwind down to the end, going nearly 36 hours past its scheduled end on the brink of collapsing talks, with some decisions being rushed through. After all the chaos in Egypt, what is Trinidad and Tobago's takeaway?
We look forward to working with the incoming presidency of COP28, which is the United Arab Emirates, to further build on this aspect of the international climate agenda in this critical decade of climate action. In keeping with the momentum from COP27, the Ministry of Planning and Development continues its role in ensuring that Trinidad and Tobago is meeting its commitment under the Paris Agreement, while at the same time being able to benefit from financing, capacity building, and other technical support available from the international system. We continue to engage constructively with our efforts towards achieving our climate objectives, and we look forward to COP28, where we hope to build on outcomes of both COP26 and COP27. We aim to improve our mitigation ambition as we aim to submit our enhanced NDC in contribution to the global climate change solution.
Kishan Kumar Singh, the head of the Multilateral Environmental Agreements Unit at the Planning and Development Ministry, explained further.
Going forward, as we continue the implementation of our own domestic climate agenda, which is, of course, guided by the international policy framework, which is largely dictated by international instruments like the Paris Agreement and the Climate Change Convention, but also by the decisions taken at the COP as the supreme decision-making body, and under which countries are expected to comply and abide.
Kumar Singh is widely known at these international climate conferences, as he's attended nearly every COP in the last decade. He's the co-chair of the Glasgow Sharm el-Sheikh Work Programme on the Global Goal on Adaptation within the United Nations Framework for Climate Change Convention, and he has led the Multilateral Environmental Agreements Unit at the Planning Ministry since 1998. On COP27's final decision, Kumar Singh said,
"We will now focus on analyzing in its totality the decisions and the conclusions that came out of COP27 with a view to incorporating those into the national policy and legislative framework, such as the Just Transition Work Programme, response measures issues and innovative technologies, the evolving rules under the Article 6 carbon market, particularly regarding removals given our interest in pursuing carbon capture and storage. We'll also be exploring opportunities for advancing the national climate change agenda, particularly regarding the informal discussions and the outcomes and where we can see opportunities, such as methane reduction and low carbon development, and see whether they may afford opportunities and for us to benefit. And of course, to continue to engage in the multilateral process towards COP28, particularly in respect of increasing ambition to keep the trajectory of 1.5 degrees Celsius of the Paris Agreement.
Though the Planning Ministry has taken the lead on all climate change-related aspects of policy, different arms of the government, both in Trinidad and Tobago, have undertaken climate adaptation and mitigation measures. Recognizing the need to venture into flooding to restore power, the Trinidad and Tobago Electricity Commission purchased and commissioned an amphibious vehicle which has already been in heavy use since it arrived in the country due to widespread floods. The Ministry of Works and Transport, as we saw earlier, have installed flood pumps across various river basins in Trinidad, with a flood gauge installed at La Fortune, Pluck Road, Woodland. The Works and Transport Ministry this past year, through its Coastal Protection Unit, has worked on 974 kilometers of coastline across the country, protecting vulnerable areas from coastal erosion. Meanwhile, in Tobago, rock revetments were also installed along the coastline of the Magdalena Grande to mitigate erosion. However, these measures can only go so far. Once the planet continues to warm, the seas continue to rise, and the ripple effects of a hotter, more extreme world reverberate globally, small islands may not stand a chance. We've seen the impacts of climate change, and we've heard what private sector and the government are doing. But this is a global problem, and it requires global solutions. That's why events like COP27, where world leaders meet on a global stage to bring solutions to problems and limit global warming below 1.5 degrees Celsius, are so important to give small island developing states like Trinidad and Tobago a fighting chance, so we don't have to replace our vehicles for boats in the future. Kalain Hussein, CNC3 News.